And my number one favorite movie is Shrek. No. Hey guys, what's going on? It's Evan, and today I wanted to talk about my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Now, before I start, I just want to let everybody know that this is not the be-all end-all list of movies. I feel the need to say that, even though, you know, my opinion isn't hugely whatever. I'm saying it just because people seem to think that just because I like certain movies that I don't like other movies, or that I think some movies are better than others. I like movies for specific reasons, and my reason specifically mostly has to do with those movies being guilty pleasure type movies. I like movies for the sake of the entertainment value a little bit more than I like them being these exercises of the mind and really well-written pieces. I love movies like that too, and there are movies on my list like that. But more than anything, I do like the movies that I find memorable and can rewatch several times without having to think about the psychological incursions of writing a thesis paper on all of the material in these movies. So yeah, so with that out of the way, I think it'd be easier for me to introduce my very first movie, my number 10 on the list, Bruce Almighty. This movie's probably one of my favorite movies out there just because I've always found it extremely rewatchable. I watch it constantly, I love the concept, it's just silly and weird enough that I just love to revisit it as often as possible. I think Jim Carrey is a great lead, I love Jennifer Aniston in this movie, I think that Morgan Freeman plays a really great god. I think it's a very laid-back, fun story and a fun movie. It can get extremely silly and a little bit over the top, but I think that's what I like so much about it. Sometimes I enjoy a movie that just doesn't care a lot about itself and just tries a little bit more than anything to be fun. And I think a lot of comedy movies are having that issue now where they're always trying to make points and they're always trying to be very in your face with the dry humor and stuff, and I love dry humor. I just think that goofy humor sometimes works a little too in live action, and this is a prime example of that. So this is why this movie is my number 10 favorite movie of all time. My number 9 movie is also another guilty pleasure, and I don't have a physical copy of it because a couple years ago I lent it out to a friend, and I haven't seen that friend pretty much since. My number 9 movie is Freddy vs. Jason, which is a huge, huge guilty pleasure movie for me. I've always been a big horror movie fan. Horror was always my big thing, and Freddy Krueger is undoubtedly my favorite icon in film, probably still. Just a really dark action movie. It wasn't even a horror movie. I can obviously point out its shortcomings in half a second. It's not a good movie, but it's absolutely one of my favorite movies regardless. This falls strictly into the realm of guilty pleasure just because it's so ridiculous and so weird and so odd, and it shouldn't even exist, honestly. But it's such a fun movie. Just watching it for the sake of the novelty of seeing these two characters come together from two different franchises and duking it out, it's great. It's kind of one of the things I love so much about the first Alien vs. Predator movie. Not so much the second, but you know, the whole point of a versus movie or a crossover movie is that it's just this novelty of seeing these characters come together. It's what made the Avengers so successful and so fun, and I'm pretty sure that what makes this, on a much smaller scale, just as enjoyable. My number 8 movie is actually 8 movies. Harry Potter franchise. The whole thing. These movies were a big part of me growing up. I basically kind of grew up with these characters and with what was going on with these movies and stuff. I got so impatient after the 5th movie came out that I actually went and read the 6th and 7th books just so that I could know more about what was going on in the story. It's probably one of my favorite stories out there. I love the fantasy stuff. I love the aspects of the craziness of this world. It was one of the first introductions I've had to a universe in film, because I was never really switched on to something like that. I was switched on to franchises, but I was never really switched on to world building, and this franchise is definitely where I learned a lot about how world building can be and how stuff can relate back to each other and how everything kind of fits together in a cohesive narrative. This is basically one long movie. Also, it's not, but yeah, it kind of is. Number 7 is kind of a surprise for me just because I haven't seen this movie in a while, but I did watch it again recently, and yeah, I can see why it fits. Misery. It's a Stephen King movie. I love Stephen King. I think Stephen King is great. This one made the list just because I think the concept is so simple and scary. It's just one of my favorite things ever. It's a very low-key horror film. It's about the idea of fanatic and what makes people obsessed with something and how far that obsession can take you. This is one of the examples of one of the more well-written, deep concepts of screenwriting and filmmaking and stuff. It's just a fun movie, it makes you think, and I think that because of that, it's definitely earned its place on this list just because, you know, Number 6 is Shrek. It's not. No, my number 6 movie is Psycho, and Psycho is probably one of my favorite movies out there, even though, admittedly, I have only actually seen it recently. I saw it in my first semester of college in in my film class, and I'm very kind of disappointed in myself for not having seen it already, especially because I wanted to get into film, and film was one of those things that I've always wanted to do. I haven't seen a lot of the classics that I probably should have by now, and one of these days I want to go back and watch all the stuff that will hopefully help me get a better understanding and appreciation for film. But Psycho is absolutely one of those movies that have absolutely earned its praise. It set and defined a lot of the genre that it created, you know, a lot of the horror, suspense, anticipation type genres, and it's just a good movie. It's still a good movie today. I think what I like the most about it is the way that it uses atmosphere to frighten a viewer. It's one of the first movies to do that. It uses lighting and film techniques of, you know, specific, you know, the way that you look at things, and the way music and sound effects and stuff like that kind of make you anticipate things. And I think that it's definitely perfected that. It's one of those movies that knows what it's doing in terms of having to get an emotional response from the viewer. And I think it definitely earned its praise because of that. Number 5 on my list is also a horror movie, and it's also very recent of a horror movie. It's a movie called The Babadook, and if you haven't seen this movie yet, I absolutely suggest you go check it out. It's on Netflix. It's another one of those very specific form of the mind type movies where, you know, so it's psychological, you have to think about it. There's a lot of imagery and message and stuff like that that you have to think about. And it's another one of those movies that I appreciate for that reason, and it's one of the few movies of this type that I can rewatch and really think about and not care too much about the fact that I'm rewatching it just for the sake of trying to figure stuff out. The Babadook is one of the first horror movies I've seen in a very long time to not exercise the use of jump scares, which is a big deal because a lot of movies nowadays are oversaturated with jump scares, and jump scares are a very cheap way of getting somebody to have a reaction, which I don't mind it. I really don't. I don't think a horror movie is less of a horror movie because there's a jump scare in it. I love the Insidious movies, for example, and that's pretty much 80% of the movies usually. A movie can have a good story and still have jump scares, so I don't mind it that much. The Babadook, however, has, I think, one jump scare, and I say I think because I really don't consider it that much of a jump scare. It's not really there to immediately frighten you. It's there to increase the urgency, but I don't think it would necessarily, like, jump out at you and scare you. Like, I've seen the movie, I don't really think that it has that effect. It didn't have that effect on me. What did have an effect on me, however, is the atmosphere that this movie creates. This movie was the very first horror movie I have ever seen that I've actually had to pause the movie in the middle to calm down. Now, a lot of people will definitely consider that an overreaction, but honestly, I've never had such an emotional reaction to a movie that's made me stop and worry so much about what's going on in the movie. There are no jump scares, but the monster in the movie is scary enough. The concept, the presence of this monster is horrifying enough to actually warrant a break. And I think that is saying something about it being a horror movie. It's a masterful movie. Number 4 on the list is Tarzan. Now, this was tough for me. Basically, I wanted my number 4 slot to be a Disney movie, so I recategorized in my head all the Disney movies that I watched over the years and which ones were the best ones. This is one of the ones I grew up with that I just love the most. I love the story, I love the music, I love all the stuff about this movie. It's probably one of my favorite animated movies out there, right next to Aladdin, and the only reason why Aladdin is so high on the list is because I played Aladdin in an elementary school play, so I knew that movie like the back of my hands. I love all the songs. I think that it's just a very vibrant, free-feeling movie, and it's also one of the darkest ones, which I guess is really messed up. Dude hangs himself at the end of it. This I'm not afraid of spoiling. If you haven't seen this already, you're not gonna. Number 3 on the list is The Dark Knight. Do I even need to explain this one? Honestly, there's so many good things about this movie. It's a guilty pleasure movie, and at the same time, it's also a psychological piece. There's so much going on in this movie. There's so much that this movie has to offer in terms of teaching us about stuff and having a message and having to do with something. This was one of the first superhero movies out there that actually had a message and actually had meaty dialogue and just this really, it's one of the better movies out there in general. It's not even just a good superhero movie. This movie by itself classifies as just a good movie. Not many movies at the time could say that. Actually, Iron Man came out the same year and did a similar thing. I just think that The Dark Knight and Iron Man really did kick off this whole superhero movie genre thing where people started to take it more seriously. And I think that that is a testament to exactly how far superhero movies have come and why I love superhero movies so much. Speaking of superhero movies, my number 2 movie is another superhero movie. Captain America: Winter Soldier. I have never watched a movie more than I've watched this one. This movie came out 2 years ago, and I can say without question that I have watched it 17 times, non-stop. Not non-stop, because that would be ridiculous. Imagine watching a marathon of the same movie 17 times. Wow. It's this really deep and detailed story surrounded by these characters, and I think that the movie does this spectacular job at juggling all of its subject matter and all of its characters so well. And at the center of it, there's a political argument. I think that this is probably one of the better installments in the Marvel Universe, and one of the, if not the best superhero movie out there. Feel free to, disagree. It's just, personally, I have never had a better, full-rounded experience with a superhero movie. Then again, I really liked Captain America 1, so I might just be biased. And to wrap this up, I want to give you guys my #1 favorite movie of all time. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Honestly, if you couldn't guess this, then you have not seen one of my other videos. You should know by now that this is the movie that kick-started my love for film, in general. It was one of the first movies that I ever saw. It was one of my favorite movies out there. I would rewatch it constantly. It was my favorite franchise of all time, despite how weird and creepy and ridiculous it gets towards the end. It's just one of those things that when I first saw it, I realized that there was a process behind filmmaking. Even if the effects looked fake from time to time, I would look at that and go, wow, somebody made that. And now suddenly I want to know how that's made or how that's done. And it's one of the things that I love so much about this movie. And it's why, without question, it makes this #1 on my list. Because if it didn't, then I'd be doing a disservice to myself. It's one of my favorite movies because it kick-started my love for movies in general. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my list. Feel free to tell me what your top 10 favorite movies are and for what reasons. Again, my list should have nothing to do with yours. All the things that I like are just circumstantial to me, and I'm sure that a lot of the stuff that you guys like are circumstantial to you and what you grew up liking and enjoying and stuff like that too. So yeah, feel free to share what your favorite movie is in the comments down below. Feel free to like this video, subscribe if you like what you've seen, and yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you guys soon. To be honest, my true #1 is really... I'm serious.